Okay, so we're in the book of Ruth today. That's Ruth in Romanian. And French, I don't know how you say it. Ruth, Ruth, yeah. So you actually have the th sound, do you? That's cool. That book is just after Judges and before 1 Samuel. It's a nice little sandwiched in there between those two meaty pieces of historical documents. And we just have this really nice little story here. Ruth was always fascinating to me when I first became a Christian because I started reading the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And I read Genesis with all the fascination of creation, Abraham, and that story, and got a bit bogged down in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And then it started picking up again for me in Joshua and Judges, where there's all these fights and these things happening, and it's really cool. Do you need help finding Ruth?
No.
Yeah, maybe Andrea can help you if you do get stuck. And then suddenly all of these battles and all these fights, they just sort of disappear for 4 chapters when you get to the book of Ruth. And this just fascinated me because I read it. I thought, I don't understand this book at all. What's the point of this book? What's going on here? All these weird things, kingsmen, redeemers, threshing floors, wheat, mothers-in-law. Like, what is all of this? So that led me to study it a lot more deeply. And when I was in seminary, I did what no seminary student ever does. I took out books from the library for summer. One of those books was a commentary on Ruth, because I just had to understand this book of Ruth. It just didn't make any sense. Why is it there? What's its purpose? And I brought out, I can't remember who wrote it, but I think Hubbard might have been the guy's surname. I don't remember the series. It's the New International Commentaries on the Old Testament, big blue cover. Brilliant series of commentaries. But what he said was, Ruth brings a smile to scholars' faces. So in the midst of all the books of the Bible that scholars are debating and causing problems and working through and fighting each other over, Ruth just brings a smile to everyone's face. That's kind of like a nice little idea. I mean, you probably relate to that, right? The story of Ruth is just a nice little story. Have you all read the book of Ruth? Yeah? No? Luca hasn't? That's fine. That's no problem. You've only been a Christian for a year, right? So that's fine. Well, that whole idea of bringing a smile to our faces, I'm going to shatter it today. I'm going to rip it up into a million pieces and throw it all over the ground. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to maybe say some things that you probably haven't thought of before, and we can discuss those things at the end if you want to. But the idea is that there are some things that people have just kind of naturally inserted into the narrative, like, oh, it's this romance story, and it is that, but there is other stuff to consider as well, which people generally don't consider, that I want us to think about today. So just for Luca's sake, Ruth is a story about a woman who leaves her homeland, follows her mother-in-law, comes to the land of Israel, becomes a Christian, and marries and continues the line of the Messiah, basically. So she's like the great-grandmother of David, eventually King David. So I remember, you guys are Romanian, so you know everything that Romanians teach about books like the Book of Ruth, right? I suppose you didn't. Neither of you grew up in Protestant churches, so that's redundant. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Forget what I just said there. Basically, the idea is that people have these preconceptions because we've talked about the Book of Ruth and it's this lovely little story, and so no one wants to hear anything other than that it's a really nice story. And I remember I shared, my wife and I, Emma and I, we were sitting once at a table with another couple, and I shared some of my opinions on the Book of Ruth, and Emma sat next to me and said, "What?" And then the guy in front of me said, "What?" And then his wife was like, "No, he's right." So I was like, maybe we should just like swap places. So it was just funny to see that. So what I will say is we are dealing with a nice story. In the midst of all these battles and betrayals and God's judgments, it is a really nice story that breaks up the narrative of the Bible history. But it's not quite the romantic story that we're used to. It is a romance story. It is a great story, but it's not quite everything that we've been built to believe. And even within that, ultimately it's about God's faithfulness, okay? And that tends to get lost in a lot of preaching on Ruth. It's not about Ruth per se, even though the book's named after her. It's about what God's doing for Israel, for his people, and individually in Ruth and Boaz and Naomi's lives. So who wrote the book of Ruth? Nobody knows. That's typical, right? Nobody knows. The biggest speculation would be Samuel, who we'll encounter in the next book of the Bible. He was a judge of Israel, the last judge of Israel before the monarchy was set up. And it's probable that he wrote this genealogy, this book, as a way of helping David understand his family genealogy, because we'll see later on Actually, let me just read that for you right now. At the end of the book of Ruth, the last sort of 2 or 3 verses, from verse 18 to chapter 4, we see that this is a genealogy, ultimately. It's a story to show where David's descendants came from, King David. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nashon. Nashon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz, who is a key character in this narrative. And then we read, Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Okay. And if you want to go further, you can look at the New Testament genealogies, and you see that from David we then get to Jesus. Okay. So this is very important. It's not just some random story in the middle of the Bible. And so you have the 7 generations from Perez to Boaz, and then 3 to David. So that means that Ruth is the great grandmother of King David, or the great grandmother of King David. This math is terrible. I hate maths. So it's probable that this book was written for David by Samuel or someone in his court, maybe the prophet Nathan, as a way of helping him understand how they got to where they are. We don't know anything other than that. Anything else is speculation. So what's the context? Well, we know that this book was written, this story happened during the time of the Judges. So everything that we saw in the last lesson in the book of Judges, this is happening at some point within that story. Okay, and we know that because in verse 1 of chapter 1 we read, in the days when the Judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So that very first sentence, in the days when the Judges ruled, meaning that this book is set in the context of the previous book. And again, since it ends at David's genealogy, it's pretty certain that it was written while David was alive, or therein, either just after he died or while he was still alive. I would say it's more likely that it was written while he was alive. So what's the purpose, the spiritual purpose of this book? I would say the idea is faith. We have to see what human faith in God looks like, but we also have to see what God's faithfulness to his people looks like, and even to outsiders who aren't part of his covenant people. And in that, we'll see the idea of kindness, and that will especially be shown in the story of Boaz as we get there. You're looking a bit confused. You okay? Yeah. Still jet lagged, right? Yeah, okay. I'll try and speak slower. So as we study the idea of faith, we'll go through the book and then come back around to God. And so we know the story is very familiar. In chapter 1, we see that it starts in the land of Moab. That's outside of Israel. We see that there's a famine in Israel. So these gentlemen, this lady, Naomi, and her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, that's verse 2 there. They leave the land of Israel and they marry women from this land of Moab. And there they find provisions and they look after themselves there. They marry Ruth and what was the name of the other one? I forget her name. Ruth, what was Ruth's sister? Oprah. Is it Oprah? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's right. I was thinking Oprah Winfrey? No one's getting Mercedes today. Right, and then what happens after the sons marry? Boom, they die. Okay, it's famine time, right? People died in famine time, and so that leaves Naomi and these 2 young ladies, and they're all on their own. So Naomi then starts planning to go back home to Israel, to the town of Bethlehem, which should be a very familiar town name to you all. So what I want us to see first of all is that the story starts with its foundation in faithlessness. Naomi and her sons have left the promised land. Like God told the people of Israel very clearly, you are to remain in this land. This is land for you. It's the land flowing with milk and honey. This is your land that I've given you. But as soon as a famine strikes, they say, oh, we don't want this anymore. We're going to go to Moab, where there's probably going to be better provisions. And time again, you see God's people do that in the Old Testament. Abraham, for example, what was he told? Go to the land of Canaan, make your tents there. Oh, a famine hits. I'm going to go down to Egypt, right? That's a theme among God's people in the Old Testament. When things get hard, they abandon the promise. And so they're rooting this story in the lack of faithfulness from Naomi and her sons. And then to make matters worse, these men married foreign women. And Deuteronomy 7 verse 3 makes it very clear that that's not okay. Deuteronomy 7 verse 3, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. And the reason in verse 4 is given, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will destroy you quickly. So that's a very serious thing for an Israelite person to just leave their country and marry someone from a different country, okay? Especially when they've not been what we would say proselytized. They've not been brought into the Jewish faith. It's a bad thing for them to do, and they shouldn't have done it. And so when we see that in the Old Testament, it gives us a bit of comfort, right? Because we so often leave the path of faithfulness in hard times, don't we? We might not leave the church because things got hard, though some people do. We might not leave our countries because the economic situation is difficult, but we certainly abandon faith in critical moments when we're required to stand up and be counted. You know, you guys could be at college or at work, and someone's saying, everyone should be gay, everyone should be following my ideology, and you know you need to say, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to believe that. But then you cower away and you run away from that situation rather than standing firm on your faith, right? I think we've all been guilty of that on some level, right? Yeah, okay. So guess what? We have solidarity with the Old Testament believers. That's great, because the scriptures are presenting these people in a good light. They made mistakes, they were faithless sometimes, but they're presented in a good light, which means that when we make the same mistakes as they do, we can rejoice in the God of forgiveness and remember that faith isn't based on being perfect. We will make mistakes, and we ask God for forgiveness when we sin against him and when we act in faithlessness, and then we move on, just like the Old Testament believers did. So in that situation, Naomi is now left without sons and these two daughters-in-law, and what does she do? She tells them to go home. Well, how silly is that? It's like anti-evangelism, right? Come with me, come to Israel, come and learn about Yahweh, the one sovereign God of the universe. Now go home, go back to your gods, you know, they'll provide for you rather than my God. It's anti-evangelism what she's doing here, which is just a devastation for any of us, right? We all here love evangelism, and we're reading this woman who had the perfect opportunity to bring two young women who were attached to her into Israel, into the Hebrew faith, and she's like, go home. Like, it makes me cringe, right? Just to think about that. Like, you had a gospel opportunity here. It was wide open in front of you, and you're just like, nah, I'm not going to do that. It's crazy. And so when she returns, Ruth 1, verse 21, it tells us, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. So she does eventually go back, and you see she's just completely distraught with the Jewish faith. Like, she hasn't abandoned Yahweh, she hasn't abandoned God at all. But you can see in this statement in verse 21 here that she's just distraught and is lacking trust. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. So she's not denying that he's there, he's not denying, but she is saying, look what he's done to me, he's brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Naomi meaning sweet in Hebrew. When the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. And then Naomi asks for her name to be changed to Mara, which means bitterness. So she changes her name from sweet to bitter, indicating her situation with her sons having died. So you see, she hasn't abandoned her faith there. I see, I got a bit messed up in my notes there. Okay, carrying on. But she is bitter. She is bitter over her circumstances, okay? So she's a believer, she's there, but she's bitter. She's been faithless, and she's paid the price for it, and now she's dealing with the bitterness that comes with faithlessness. And I think that's important for us as well, because so often we let our circumstances control our reactions, rather than how the Bible calls us to live, how God's word calls us to live. We say, that situation is overcoming me now, and I just want to fall apart. I want to crawl up on my bed in depression. I want to just sit in my room filled with anxiety. And we let whatever's affecting us in that moment lead how we live our lives, rather than going back to scripture, rather than going to prayer and saying, come what may, I still have everything I need in the providence of God. And that's exactly what Naomi's doing. She's saying, stop calling me sweetness, call me bitterness now. Like, that's just, it's just too, there's deep culture in there, but just to our culture today, it just seems so childish, right? Like, my name means sweet, but I don't feel sweet anymore, so call me bitter, you know? Obviously, that's not the same situation there, but it's just how it is. And that's what we do, right? You know, how many people in the world have a name like God loves as their surname, like Gottliebe in German, or there was a guy I met in Georgia this last week, what was his surname? Good Life. His name was Good Life. Like, it'd be like him saying, "Well, my name means good life, but things aren't working out right now, so my name's Bad Life." Like, and that's what we do. That's what we do as Christians. We get so jammed up with the circumstances of life, and we start allowing those circumstances to control us, and we become depressed and anxious. And that's why in counseling, we try to encourage people not to focus on their circumstances per se, but to respond well to their circumstances. So life's getting you down. Things are just crashing around all around you. You lost your job. You lost your degree. You failed an exam. Your dream job didn't work out. You didn't get the girl. You didn't get the guy. All these things that you wanted to work out didn't work out. And now you're just like, what is my life? Well, your life is Jesus Christ. Those circumstances don't dictate who you are. Jesus Christ and his word dictate who you are. And that's what we need to encourage people in counseling. Your identity is in Christ, not those other things that didn't work out for you. And that's what Naomi needed to do. Rather than focus on her bitter suffering and her sorrow, which is genuine, it's not condemning being sad for the loss of her sons, but she needs to get herself out of the situation and remind herself, Yahweh, the God that I worship, that I've left to live in the land of Moab, he is the God of providence. When my people were in the desert for all those years, he provided all of the quail, all of the manna that they needed. He provided water from the rock. That is my God. He's the God of providence, and he will get me through this situation if I rely on him. And so in response to Naomi's situation, we then see Ruth say, because she's so desperate to stay with her, in verse 16 through to 18, Naomi's trying to get Ruth to go away, but she says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Now that's often heralded as a great conversion and steps towards faithfulness. Guess what? I don't agree. I think it led to great faith one day, but this is not a conversion in my opinion right now. And just know that that's just my opinion. The majority of scholars disagree. They would say that this is a conversion, so just keep that in your minds. But I disagree because she's a Moabitess who would have had her own gods, and she even confesses that she's going to leave her gods behind to take up the Hebrew God. It just seems to me like she's trading gods in desperation of being with Naomi. Like, she loves Naomi and she wants to follow Naomi, and she said, "I'm prepared to pay whatever price I can just to follow Naomi." It's not, "I really want to follow the God of Israel." It's, "I want to follow Naomi, and if I have to follow the God of Israel in order to follow Naomi, then that's what I'm going to do." Okay. Now, I believe that while she was in Israel, she was learning about Yahweh, about the God of Israel, and she would have eventually become a true believer and a faithful one at that. But this particular instance here, she's just trying to follow Naomi. She's not confessing faith in God. And I think that's important as we look at conversions today. I think in our desperation to see high numbers in churches, it's very easy for us to try and push people towards a conversion like that and say, "Oh, well, you just have to put your hand up and say, I'm a Christian," or "You have to sign this card," or, you just have to feel something, and that means you're a Christian now today, right? I think I understand it, sincerely I do, because, churches are on the decline and we're constantly fighting against the world to bring converts. And it's getting harder and harder to do that with the way the world is going. But we need to be faithful about it. We need to bring about converts the way the Bible tells us to bring about converts, and not to be like, "Oh, well, just because they said this thing, that means they're absolutely a Christian." We do them a disservice, and we do our churches a disservice as we do that. Conversion is based on Jesus Christ, not on simple words that people say in the moment of panic or distress or worry because they learned about hell, right? Conversions are based on the gospel, and that's shown over time as those people show with their lives that they have truly believed. So the two end up eventually in Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth. Now, Bethlehem, why is that an important city? Or town, rather? Who knows? Who else was born in Bethlehem? Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So this is the hometown of Jesus we're talking about here. It's irrelevant information, but it basically means the house of bread or food, Bethlehem. Bet being house, lehem being the word for bread. It can also mean food as well, so who knows if it means the house of bread or the house of food. But That's the idea. And she goes there, ironically, just for the name of the town, as the harvest is starting. So, you get a real sense of this is the house of bread. You think this woman's coming from a foreign country in a time of famine. She comes to a place called the house of bread, and then there's this grain harvest happening right before her. That must have been quite amazing. So this leads Ruth to a field owned by a guy called Boaz, and she starts working there. She starts taking out the bits of corn or grain rather, which the other workers didn't pick up. And as they worked, then some of it would fall on the ground. She was just following them and picking it up as she went. Boaz noticed that, and actually, as it turns out, he was a distant relative of Naomi's, so that made him family. And so what Boaz does there is he allows Ruth to work in his field, and he's obeying God's law as he does that. If you want to turn real quick to Leviticus 19, verse 9. Leviticus 19, verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And that's another act of providence for God, for the poor people to go into the field and then take what was left of the harvest. So that's just a nice little provision that God had. Boaz is a faithful man, so he's obeying this command very seriously. And so he shows that faithfulness, but in showing that faithfulness, he's also showing a kindness to Ruth, isn't he? I didn't note down the verse exactly, but he says specifically to her, stay in my field, work with my men, because if you go to another field, you may be assaulted there. Basically, it's pretty obvious what he's saying. If you go to another field, someone might rape you there. That's what he's saying. And so he's showing her kindness in saying, you might be a foreigner, but I'm going to look after you. I'm going to protect you. You're in my field. Whatever happens to you is a reflection of what of me. So I'm going to make sure you're safe there. So he's showing faithfulness, and as a result of faithfulness, he's showing kindness. And that's exactly how it is with our God, isn't it? He has shown us steadfast kindness and by being faithful to us. He doesn't throw us away to hell just because we mess up. He doesn't throw us to the dogs in this life because we mess up and sin. He keeps us in his covenant. He keeps us in his graces. And in doing so, that is an act of kindness. So faithfulness and kindness are both mixed together in this. And they flow nicely together. And he's especially shown that in giving us the law. You see right there in Leviticus 19, the law was there for people's good. There were acts of kindness in the law. And God has done that. If you stay faithful to this law, then you're going to be showing kindness to the people around you as well. And that's a providence of God there. And so we learn kindness towards others by observing the law. For example, the Ten Commandments. There's a reason it says don't murder. It's not kind, right? That's a bit flippant, I know, but that's the idea. Don't steal. It's not kind. So be faithful to these commands and you'll show kindness to your neighbors. If you don't steal, you're showing them a kindness. If you don't kill them or get angry with them, then you're showing them a kindness. Faithfulness and kindness are so closely bound up in this book. It's just wonderful to see. So think about how faithfulness and kindness blend together in your own context. Now, do we all have driver's licenses here? Yeah? No? Lara doesn't. Luca, you have a driver's license, right? Yeah, but it's French, so yeah. Roundabout. Yeah, as you know, I love to talk about driving in my lessons. Faithfulness to God's commands is not getting angry when someone cuts me off in traffic, right? But if I get angry, I beat my horn, and that's not very kind, is it? So if I show faithfulness to God's law, then I also show kindness to the people that do me wrong, right? When you're at work, if you're faithful to God's word, then you'll help those people that need help at work, right? Even if that adds to your burdens in work, that's also kind for them. In the church, if you want to be faithful and serve in your local church, then you're showing a kindness to the other people that are part of that church. So faithfulness and kindness are woven together in this sense. And I just want you guys to focus and think about how that applies to your own context. So hopefully those examples blend things well together and open us up to consider what happens next, which is very interesting. Ruth, we're about sort of at the end of chapter 2 into chapter 3 here. Ruth goes back to Naomi and explains everything that happened. She's got all this food, and she says, this man Boaz was so kind to me. And Naomi's like, oh, okay, he's a distant relative of Mars, so yeah, go marry him. No, just kidding. Not quite that direct, but what she does is she says, put on your nice clothes, like doll yourself up, dress up really nicely, make yourself smell really nice, and go to what they call the threshing floor. That's just, where they dig grain, and That's where a lot of the men ended up sleeping that worked on the field. And go to Boaz there and lie at his feet. And when he wakes up, ask him to to cover you a bit with his garment, with like his cloak that he was sleeping in. Now, according to the scholars, that's basically a marriage proposal. Like he's saying, I'll put this cloak over you, you're under my protection. And so he's engaged to her at that point. And then he says, but you've got to leave this room before the morning when everyone can recognize you. He doesn't want to be seen with a woman there. That might just be a reputation thing. It might be because she might have been in some kind of danger if she was a woman on the threshing floor. I don't know. It definitely seems that the men there were drunk, and so they would probably be sleeping off hangovers. So at the very best, she probably would have been like, "Hey, girl," like got that kind of catcalling. So we don't know really, but personally, I see this as a bit manipulative on Naomi's part. All she had to do was go and set up a meeting with her relative Boaz, who's a relative of hers, so she definitely could have found time to meet him, and said, "Hey, Boaz, do you like this girl? You want to marry her?" Like, it wouldn't have been that hard. But instead, she kind of put Ruth in danger, saying, "Go and glean in this field, and it might be the right field, it might not be the right field. Go onto this threshing floor where you equally might be in danger, and kind of seduce this guy. Like when he's drunk in the middle of the night, like get him to wake up and say, 'I'll marry you.' Like, it's a bit crazy. Now, that doesn't diminish the results of the marriage. It doesn't diminish the romance that did bud from it, but just seems from my part a little bit manipulative on Naomi's part. In any case, Ruth does as Naomi asks and is then essentially engaged to Boaz. So that leads us to chapter 4, where basically, let's just read a little bit of that. So Boaz goes to the gate of the city, and that's where the elders would normally gather. And actually, that's really interesting. I don't want to talk about Georgia too much, but basically, we went to a village in Georgia, and they still have that practice today. We went to like the city square, the village square, like rundown village, middle of nowhere. It was an Azerbaijani village. Everyone there was from Azerbaijan. And the guy that took us around, he said, well, you see, these guys would actually congregate here, and if there's any business that the village needs to conduct, they'll do it here in this square. That's exactly what they did in Israel at the time. The elders would meet at the gate, and they would discuss political issues involving their town or village right there at the gate. So that's just really cool to see a real-life edition of that. We don't have townhouses in some countries. Here, all of that's done behind closed doors. We're not allowed to see it. We're not allowed to listen to it because then they can get away with their corruption. But some countries still have it done in the public square where everyone can partake in here. So verse 3 here. Naomi has come back from the country of Moab and is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So basically what's happening there, according to Israelite law, someone had to redeem the land. Okay, so this guy's dead now. Naomi wants to sell it. And so this guy, who is a relative of Naomi's, gets the chance to redeem the land. So he gets the chance to buy the land for himself. And in so doing, he would also inherit the widow of the man who died. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. So Naomi is selling this land and with of her son. And since Ruth was married to her son, Ruth is like kind of part of the deal. Like, I don't know how else to say that. Sounds a bit harsh, but basically, if you wanted to redeem the land to buy the land, you would also have to take Ruth as your wife. And so Boaz is in line for this, but there is also a closer redeemer, a closer relative who would have the first choice. And he says, yeah, sure, I'll take it. And it's like, oh no, the story's going to fall apart. But then Boaz is very clever and he says, actually, if you take this land, you're going to have to marry Ruth as well. And he's like, oh, that would ruin my household because then he'd have this wife to contend with and his sons wouldn't get all of the money when he dies. And he's like, I can't redeem this. I don't want this. And so it goes back to Boaz. And so the matter is settled and they get married and eventually they have a child called Obed. And as we've just seen, that child Obed then was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. So you see how redemptive history is moving through this story. So what I want to say is whether there was scheming and plotting here or not, the story has a happy ending. You know, there's two lovely couple, they get married, and they have a child, and we see a lovely mix of faith and kindness blending together to create a nice story which actually has a place in redemptive history. It's quite amazing, really. And that then leads us to consider God's faithfulness in the story. So we've seen human faithfulness, we've seen human kindness, and now we need to see what God is showing faithful and kindness throughout the story. So on the surface, especially compared to other books, it seems that there's very little God in this book. Like, they talk about God, but God doesn't actively seem to be doing anything here. And as far as the narrative goes, that's true. It's a historical document. It's not designed to show what divine forces were working in the background. It's just there to give us a history of what happened. But when we step back from the narrative directly with our understanding, when we do that with our understanding of the God of history, we can see how he guided things. He absolutely led Ruth into the land of Israel so she could marry Boaz, so that Obed could be born, so that Jesse could be born, so that David could be born, so that Jesus could eventually be born. And that's within the closing genealogy there at the end of chapter 4, which we already noted. Now, David, we know, was a forefather of Jesus himself. And so basically we can put it this way. No story of Ruth, no Jesus. Right? If there was no Ruth, if there were no Ruth, there'd be no Jesus. Now, okay, that's a bit flippant. I know God works his plan and he would work around that for sure. But this is how God chose to do things. He chose to do things in a way where if there were no Ruth, then there would be no Jesus. And so that causes us to just be amazed. Like, this little story of romance that just seems so insignificant to us actually plays a massive part of redemptive history. And it's brilliant to just see what God was doing there. And I think that also, in a certain way, teaches us that there's no one insignificant in the kingdom of God. Like, everyone has their role to play. We might not be the forefathers of the Messiah. In fact, none of us ever will be, but we still have a role to play. And even though we might see ourselves as insignificant, I think there's a sense where we should see ourselves as insignificant. God is working amazing things for each one of us, and that's a wonderful thing. And so we see clearly how Ruth is a story of God's providence, ultimately. He made his promise, and through Ruth, he worked towards it in bringing the Messiah into the world. So we have an awesome, faithful God who always fulfills his promises. So we can draw encouragement here. We can be faithful because he is faithful. And as we show faithfulness, let us also show the kindness of God exemplified in Boaz as we go. Amen.